Welcome back to CrimsonCast Live. It's been a long time since we did one of these things. Scott, welcome back. Scott's got his arms up in the air already. This is an exciting time, and I'm excited as well. And we were going to start doing these during football season when it rolled around in a month or so. But you know what? Big day, big 2 days really for IU basketball, some IU football news we need to get to, a lot of stuff to talk about. Really happy to be joining you folks once again. I'm Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining as well. Scott, I think it's funny because we were getting ready to do this podcast, and you're like, what are we going to talk about with IU basketball? Is there some big news popping up? And yes, sir, there is, and I'm glad to break it to you here on the show. How you doing, first of all?
I'm good. Well, yeah, I was like, maybe we want to talk about Thomas Bryant and the NBA Summer League Finals, like not, going against Lonzo Ball. I will say too, hey, we both have new houses since this new live. Like we're in new locales. This is big time.
Yeah, no, it is quite big. I mean, different spot. Got the bar here. We're set up. We're good to go. Everything's rocking. And it's been a quiet off season for us. We had that flurry of podcasts in March, and we really appreciate you folks tuning in and listening to those. Got us up, I think, in the top 3 in the college sports iTunes charts. And, we hope to bring a lot more of that stuff to you, both for football and for basketball season upcoming for IU. It's a passion. It's something we enjoy doing, and we certainly enjoy the interactions that we have with all you folks out there. So
yeah, we've sold a ton of sponsorship. We have a deal with Russia. We can't talk about our deals with Russia, but we have some backroom deals with the Russian embassy. Yeah, we are taking over, so keep it flowing in. Yeah, you'll see us soon. Sponsored by Google and Tesla, and CrimsonCast is going big time.
If you've got any questions that you want to ask during the podcast here, please feel free to use YouTube. We got the comment channel right below. You can contact us on Twitter. That's another good spot. And we'll try to answer as many questions or comments as you got. We want to hear from you folks as far as what your thoughts are. We're going to start.
Well, let me defend myself first. Let me just defend myself.
Please, go right ahead.
I do have a full-time job. As much as I love CrimsonCast, I'm not on this all the time. And it's one of those times where July is one of the slowest months, a little bit of IndyCar, there's not much going on. And I haven't checked Twitter all day. My Twitter doesn't automatically pop up with stuff. And so unless it's a big Indy Star story or something, it doesn't pop up. So I literally haven't checked anything. Because that's when you're like, let's do a podcast. I'm like, all right, man, Miss Galen, the good times. And so I saw one signing yesterday. And I was like, oh, that sounds good. And as you know, I'm not a huge, I don't know a ton about the recruits. I'm more into when they actually play. Crack your beer. I like it.
It's actually a Dasani sparkling water, just to clarify. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, we are in our late 30s. We are not cool anymore. So I'm drinking Gatorade because I took my family out for a bike ride. I had the bike trailer with the flag and my son, a 4-year-old, a bike. Yeah, it's no more cool stuff. No. But anyway, so yes, I'm going to learn with you. Tell me the fun things that have happened.
All right, so you mentioned, of course, the recruit that did come in last night, and it's an interesting story in and of itself, and we're going to talk about it a little bit of depth here. Race Thompson, who is actually the son of, I want to say it's Daryl Thompson, who was the, I think, all-time leading rusher for the University of Minnesota, who played for the Green Bay Packers. He signed,
great name, by the way.
Great, yeah,
Thompson, that's a great name.
I don't think we've ever had a race in the history of IU basketball, maybe not in any sport. That would be one to look at. But so he signs and then says he's going, according to Inside the Hall, says he's going to reclassify back a year so that he's actually going to come to school in August and then redshirt a year, which is an unusual methodology of doing things. But I think in his case in particular, might pay a lot of dividends. And we'll talk about some of the ramifications of that. Then today, we get an announcement that Jerome Hunter, a top 60 player in the class of 2018, either the number 2 or number 3 player in the state of Ohio, 6'7" wing out of, I don't know the exact town, but anyway, a guy who had been recruited by Ohio State. He'd been recruited heavily by Michigan. He was his top 5 also had Pitt and Xavier, but he announces that he's coming to IU. That announcement comes early afternoon today, and everybody's like, wow, this is great, because that's 2 top 100 players that Archie Miller has signed, 2 4-star players that Archie Miller signed, in less than, at that point, I think in less than 18 hours. Then very shortly afterwards, we get an announcement that Demezi Anderson, who's a 6'7" forward out of South Bend Riley, who's also a 4-star, has announced that he's going to be coming to IU and playing basketball. Now, both Hunter and Anderson are 2018 class players, so they won't be getting to campus and starting until the year after this upcoming year. But that's 3 players filling scholarships, and what it means is that they still have 3 scholarships available for that upcoming year, because they'll have 5 graduating seniors at the end of this upcoming year. So
Romeo Langford could still be on the table.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. We had a question from a couple of people about, where does this leave IU with Langford? But first and foremost, I think it's fascinating. I think it was the first person I saw bring it up was Rick Bozich. Here we are a year out of last year's, magical, game-changing 2017 class in the state of Indiana, where you had all of these top players, Chris Wilkes and these other players, and none of them came to IU. You had, I think, 4 players who were 4-star or better, might have been more than that, and none of them came to IU. And, we heard a lot of excuses as to why that was the case, whether it's, they just don't fit the system here, or, there were things that happened behind the scenes, whatever the excuses happened to be. That's all that we had at the end of the day. And so IU, going into a year where they really needed to sign a top class out of the state of Indiana, ends up not really getting much. And it really kind of was it underlined a lot of the concerns that people had about the Crean era in terms of their recruiting and their ability to recruit the state of Indiana. After a strong start in the early days, it had really fallen off. And it's fascinating, you get a player in this last group of 3 that have signed here over the last couple of days. This kid, Anderson, out of South Bend, he's actually the first player that IU has signed out of South Bend since 1972, Scott. Tom Abernathy was the last player that IU signed as a scholarship player out of South Bend. And that's a big deal in terms of,
that's
looking.
Crazy.
That's nuts.
Because South Bend's like the 4th or 5th largest city in the state.
Yeah. And so for that to be, a recruiting ground that IU suddenly able to broach once again after quite a while. And granted, that's not just the Crean era, that also spans the Knight era and the Davis era. That's a pretty big statement, because that's kind of been the playground of Michigan State and Purdue for a long time. But here you have, a player out of the state of Indiana who's a 4-star. You've got a player out of Minnesota. You've got a player out of Ohio. This inside-out strategy that we heard from day one, really, that Archie Miller was espousing, it seems like they actually are planning on doing that. That seems to be the methodology that they're using, and it seems to be coming to fruition at a very early stage. What are your initial thoughts after hearing all of this?
Wow. I'm impressed, because I wasn't honestly expecting to see any good signings. I was kind of hoping for a couple, maybe getting a Romeo Langford, some kind of big hit, like maybe something this year. Like I was kind of looking toward the 19 class as like, that's when we'd really be able to get our footing in, like this time next year. That's impressive. I had not heard. I heard that the kid Race was going to come in a year. I didn't hear he was also going to redshirt. That's very interesting. This is good. I think this. And I have a point I want to make about scheduling along the same lines, but I think this just kind of goes to show, and I don't want to sit here and kick dirt on where we were, but like how just totally effed up the situation was before, and how just a fresh perspective really makes things run a lot smoother. To sign 3 players at that caliber when Archie's been on the job for 4 months, this is getting near the end of this is the end of their recruiting period. You're coming in at basically the end of the line. These kids only have a couple more months they have to commit. They've been recruited for the last 4 years by presumably coaches who've been in the same spot the whole time. What we don't know is, I don't know if they were also being recruited by Dayton or not, but this if he can do this in 4 months, imagine if he has some success and then has the full capability of Indiana behind him. This is a great way to start off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yes, there was some prior recruitment. Hunter had been recruited by Archie Miller at Dayton, and Race Thompson certainly has a close relationship with Tom Ostrom, who's on the staff as well, who came over with Archie Miller from Dayton, but who has a lot of ties back to Minnesota, which is where he is hailing from. So yeah, there's some background there, and that's okay, because certainly there's a big difference between recruiting a guy to Dayton and recruiting a guy to IU. And it's interesting because, we've had 3 people commit in the last 24 hours. So I'm confusing some of the details, but I believe that Jerome Hunter didn't pick up a scholarship offer from IU until like last month. And so this was a relatively fast-moving situation. I also think it's interesting, Scott, if you look at where these guys are coming from and who else was recruiting them. So Race Thompson certainly had Minnesota hot on his tail, being right in their backyard. Hunter, as I've already mentioned,
Race Thompson's on Arizona, from what I saw.
Yeah, I believe that was the case as well. Jerome Hunter was being recruited certainly by Ohio State, but had become kind of a lean towards Michigan, and that is no longer the case. We steal him away from there, and then Anderson had been a guy that had really been leaning towards Purdue. And in fact, you earlier on today when the news broke, if you went to the 24/7 site and they kind of list, the leans of individual players, like which way they're planning on going, they had Purdue as warm and IU was like very far down the list. So it was interesting. And this was pointed out by friend of the show, Jay Horry. We were talking back and forth on Facebook chat about this. And there was an interesting quote that I want to get to in a second. But as I look for that quote, it's refreshing to feel like, hey, IU is not only competing against other Big Ten teams for talent, but seems to be able to go head-to-head with them and beat them for players that are kind of universally valued. I mean, we're not talking about kind of long-shot 3-stars that maybe develop into really good players. I mean, these are guys that are already pretty well heralded as players that are going to be around and potentially be 2 or 3 year starters, if not more than that.
I mean, I'm not going to have to continue to talk myself into why a 2-star is a great option. And, oh, wait, but they could be the next Victor Oladipo. Like, you just wait. No, you're right. I mean,
to be fair, you never actually talked yourself into any of those guys. But anyway.
I know, but yeah. I mean, no, and that's something, go back in the archives. Like, that's something you and I did, a couple of years ago. Like, we started really looking at the recruits that we were getting and, how a guy turns out, there's a lot of factors in there. But, it's like you want to be competing against your ilk. And when you look at a lot of the recruits we had in the end of the Crean era, you're right. We were going up, against schools like, Iowa State and, Bowling Green and, Eastern Michigan. And it was like we were the only, top Division I school that was going after these guys. And it always begged the question, like, why the hell can't we, in the ones we were recruiting against, like Michigan or Iowa or Michigan State, we were losing. And I think that was something that quietly was never really fully talked about. Like, people would talk about our recruiting is soft, we're not getting the players we want, but it's like we were losing battles to all of these good schools, and the guys who were winning, we weren't really going up against those schools. And I kind of think it was partially because we were offering scholarships. Like I think you had mentioned, 2 years ago, we offered scholarships like 21 of the 25 best players. Yeah. And I think everybody was kind of using us as a leverage chip to get where they wanted to go. It's like, well, I'll just pretend to go to IU and then I'll get, Kansas to give me what they want. Or, and I think we had a very flawed strategy in a lot of different ways. So no, it's awesome to be going up against, Michigans and Arizonas and those kind of schools and Purdue's and like winning battles. I mean, and that's what we're going to have to do to build back up. Like, we're not going to go ahead and just steal Duke or Kentucky's recruiting class right away, but we start taking away from Minnesota, from Purdue, from Michigan. Like, that's how we're going to win more in the Big Ten. That's how then we're going to get to a point where we can start taking away players from Kentucky and Duke and Kansas.
Yeah, exactly. This was interesting. This was something from that I mentioned that Jay Horry found and sent to us. And this was something that was on Rivals about 10 days ago. And this was about Demezi Anderson. I'm more bullish on this one for IU than some. Purdue has recruited him for a long time, but last fall I got the vibe from Demezi that he really liked IU. He just didn't have an offer at that time. Now that there's a new staff, he has an offer and he's speeding up his process towards a decision. He also recently visited campus. And, we've heard this from quite a few people, I feel like, already over the course of the immediate aftermath of Crean being fired and Miller coming in and the new coaching staff going out and visiting with players. There was one recruit that commented on the prior coaching staff being wishy-washy about, whether they would want a player there or not, or whether they would fit or not. There were players that seemed like hadn't had much contact at all, didn't have scholarship offers. It's fascinating to me how much clarity there seems to be already in the targets that are being approached by Archie Miller and staff and what they're trying to do. And it's a jarring contrast to what we've had here over the course of the last, several years. And I find it fascinating that, a guy in a city where we don't historically recruit well, right smack dab in the middle of, the Purdue, Michigan State kind of overlap, is interested in IU. He's a 4-star prospect. He's a top 100 guy, and he doesn't have a scholarship offer from the previous coaching staff. I really found that to be telling in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, I've read some of these comments from these kids, and it's great because they what do they care? Like, they got no problem trashing the old coach. Like, they're just counting it like it is, and it's an interesting insight into the way things were. And again, I think this, I'm learning about it right now as you tell me, but it's not surprising. And, this is to all those people in, February and March who are wringing their hands and like, how could we ever get better than this guy? And can IU really recruit at an elite level? And are we going to get back? It's like, yes, it's not that hard. And if you get the right, and I'm not saying that we are just, on a train to, rocket to number 1 and go into a Final Four, but if you have the right approach and you kind of take a systematic view and you're very strategic about it, you know what the hell you're doing, and you know how to relate to kids, the players these days, this is a job that's easy to recruit for. I mean, like, we have the number 1 recruiting budget. Like, we have the history. We have a great arena. Like, we have a great fan base. Like, the hand-wringing of like, oh my God, as time passes, we really one of the elite programs. Like, yes, like if we know what we're doing, we're going to beat out, we're going to beat out Purdue and Iowa and, Minnesota every single time.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And, we'll see. I mean, certainly 3 recruits, even though they're 3 4-star recruits in a very short period of time, does not a program make. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, but it's a great sign. It's a great first step in terms of what this coaching staff is doing. It gives us a sense, frankly, of what the mentality is. And even just looking at the players themselves. I mean, I've tried to, watch some highlight videos, and granted, I'm not going to have as clarified a take about how players will fit in at the college level as the people who are going and watching them in person at the tournaments. But that said, Thompson he's a bigger guy. He looks like he's good on the boards. He's good in the post. The other 2 guys shoot well. They seem to fill the court well. Everybody seems to have range from 3, and that's sort of, that versatile swingman role at 6'6", 6'7", 6'8", sort of player, that's as basketball gets more and more positionless, you like being able to have the versatility of guys who can guard 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 positions. And it seems like IU's getting that versatility with these commits. And I think, more to the point, and this kind of leads into a couple of the questions that we'll answer here next, the ability of IU under Archie Miller now to recruit kind of next level players, because now they have this base of 4 stars that, could be 3 or 4 year guys. I mean, maybe if everything goes right, they're 3-year guys that gives you such flexibility in terms of what you're trying to do recruiting wise. And, now you can take some home run shots because you don't have to worry about, okay, are we going to be able to fill the scholarships that we've got? And that's, again, a bit different from what we've been seeing. I mean, certainly we've seen, we saw Crean and his staff, able to put rosters out on the floor. I mean, won a Big Ten title 2 years ago. But there always seemed to be that kind of concern that they weren't going to have the roster filled to the degree that they needed to, and there always seemed to be a hole somewhere on the floor.
Well, and I think what students should react for coming this fall is, this is a great reference that kids these days are going to love. Let's take a page from Elvis and do the TCB, the taking care of business. Because I will say, this is a nice, I love that this program now feels like they're just TCB, taking care of business. Like, how many off seasons have you and I done this where you have to have a podcast where we're talking about, like, all right, who's going to get booted? Like, who's going to stay? Like, who's going to get churned? And I mean, granted, there are a lot, that happens under most programs, and it happened under Knight too, but it seemed like every off season there was a ton of instability. And, you have these seasons like the year Austin Etherington left and walk-ons were leaving and like managers were leaving. And like, it seemed like a ton of turmoil and like what felt kind of like unnecessary just angst. And from everything I've heard kind of also inside and just these kind of signings, it just seems like there's not any drama. Like it's like the clouds lifted and now we're just going to work. Like we're done with all the nonsense. We're just going to go to work and we're just going to sign players. We're going to work on the schedule and we're going to train and get better. And like it's refreshing that like I can go to bed at night knowing that like my money's safe for the stock market and my IU basketball team is actually doing what they need to be doing and working on getting better.
I wouldn't put too much stock in the stock market right now, but hey, but I think the IU basketball side, you're absolutely correct. I mean, there is a definite lack of drama with IU basketball right now, and they seem to be getting things done. And I mean, those are the two things that you look for the most. And I think it's the things that, IU fans value. I mean, they value that was always the big thing with the oversigning. It just always seemed like the next season hinged on what was going to happen with the roster and who wasn't going to be here. And this, certainly there was some of that this year, but there kind of had to be because that's what Archie Miller was left with. And so I'm really fascinated to see how the rest of this plays out because the recruiting's not done yet. And so to answer a couple of questions, first of all, from James Turner, who's the reason that this podcast even is existing right now. He was the one that threw up the bat signal and asked if we were going to podcast on this. He asks me.
I still wouldn't know. I mean, I still have no idea about these signings. If it wasn't for James Turner, it'd be like next week. I'd be like, man.
I could imagine Scott like getting ready to lay down and like, it pops Twitter open. It's like, what? Why did nobody inform me about this? Yeah. So I'm happy we could do you a service, Scott. But anyway, the question from James, is it possible to still snag Finney and Langford? So for those who aren't aware, talking about Robert Finney, the guard out of McCutcheon High School in Lafayette. And then Romeo Langford, of course, I think needs no introduction, but he's the all-everything player out of New Albany. It is absolutely still possible to grab both. I think the questions for those two are different. With Langford, the question is, is there enough of a base to entice him to come to IU and play? The guy is most likely a one-and-done player, like a legitimate one-and-done player. And, the fact of the matter is there just hasn't been the baseline level of reliable talent on the floor at IU over the course of the last several years to entice a one and done type of guy to come here. Because keep in mind, if you're that quality of a player, a lot of times I think people, particularly IU fans, look at one and dones kind of pejoratively. And I think that's wrong. I don't think you should look at them like that at all. I mean, these are hyper talented basketball players who unfortunately, I think unfortunately are being forced to play college basketball as a stepping stone to get to the professional ranks because they're good enough to get there. So they have to pick the best possible situation that'll showcase their skills and put them in a good draftable position. Now, as we saw this year, Markelle Fultz went to Washington. They won like 9 games, and he was still the number 1 overall pick. So you can still.
Well, that was my question because Ben Simmons the year before went to LSU, didn't make the tournament. Had a couple marquee games. But I mean, I'm wondering like I don't want to answer my question, but do you think that's a possible trend that maybe guys are just going to go where they kind of want to go versus what, I'm going to go to Kentucky to get exposure?
I don't think Ben Simmons wanted to go to LSU. I think if you look behind the scenes on that, there was a lot of reasons he went to LSU, and want had very little to do with it, at least not his want. And I think frankly, to some degree, the Markelle Fultz thing was similar.
It's possible, yeah.
At Washington. So, but I think with Langford, it's different. Langford, I mean, he's been chased by all of the heavy players, Duke, Louisville, North Carolina came, like Roy Williams got off the plane from winning the national title in Phoenix in Louisville and got off the plane and went and talked to Romeo Langford. Like that should give you an idea of the esteem that this guy's being held in. That said,
it's nuts. It's just nuts to think of yourself, like what it must be like. Sorry, just to take a side note, like what it must be like to be a 17, 18, 16-year-old kid who, I mean, when I was in high school, like nobody would talk to me. I mean, nobody would stop and talk to me. Like I was a bagger at Mr. D's.
I mean,
like,
they still won't talk to him, folks.
Hey, yeah, now
age thing.
Right now, I just get arrested for it. But like, it's insane to think like after the national championship, like Roy Williams is coming to talk to a kid in high school. Like it's, and then like he's probably like, all right, Coach K, like shuffle out, man. I got to move on. Like it's just, it is nuts to think about it. Sorry.
No, it is. You're right. But look, as far as Langford's concerned, I think there was always going to be a lot of work.
Yeah, that
IU was going to have to do because they were just really far behind in terms of the way that people view IU, the way that players view IU. And we saw that manifest itself in the way that they recruited under Crean. Crean was able to get some good players, but they generally were players that were at the very end of the recruiting cycle. Thomas Bryant was a March recruit. Noah Vonleh was a late recruit. In that latter few years of the Crean era, that was how the recruiting, largely went. And so there's just a lot of work to be done with Langford. But I think this is the sort of thing that they needed to do if they were going to be competitive for Langford, was to lay a foundation that was unassailable. It's like, look, we're going to be a good team, maybe a very good team without you, Romeo. We're going to be a great team with you. And, there's that allure. It's the same allure, I think, that brought Cody Zeller here. It's the same allure that has brought other top players here in the past. It's this idea that,
too.
We can bring it back. Yeah, no, absolutely. You can, even if you're here for just 1 year, people still talk about Eric Gordon and what Eric Gordon contributed. And I don't think that works if you're not from Indiana, or at least from the region, and you're that caliber of a player. But I do think that there's something to that. Is that what he's going to base his opinion on or his decision on? Probably not, but maybe it's in the back of his mind. And Archie Miller certainly can't go into a recruiting meeting with Romeo Langford with that being the only thing that he's got in his hand. He's got to go in there and put a vision forward of what life is going to be like at IU and why Romeo Langford here makes more sense than what Romeo Langford would be able to do at Duke, or would he be able to do at North Carolina or Louisville. So that's why I don't think I think the jury's still out on whether they can do the sort of work. But certainly, to answer James's question, the recruits that have signed the last day don't negatively impact that. If anything, I think they positively impact it. Now, as far as Phinissee's concerned, I think the question becomes, are they going to go that route? So Phinisee, for those of you who don't know, he's a very good player. And we've got some friends of the show who are in basketball circles who are very, very high on Phinisee. And certainly this was a player that a lot of people were very interested in on the IU front. It was a player we didn't seem to be hugely in the hunt for before Archie Miller took over, and now suddenly seem to be in the hunt for, which is a positive. The flip side, though, is IU has suddenly popped up on the radar of a couple of other point guards nationwide that are pretty highly regarded themselves. One of them being Darius Garland, a player out of Nashville who's being recruited by Duke. He's being recruited by a couple other really top-level programs, as well as Vanderbilt. And then you've got this guy, David Duke, out of South Carolina, who's kind of rocketed up the charts. He's got offers from Kansas and Arizona and a couple of other programs. So it's almost like,
You should go with Dave, by the way. Just like the David Duke thing, like let's go with Dave or D Duke or something.
Well, it's funny because I had the same reaction when I saw his name. I was like, his name's David Duke, but he's an African-American gentleman from South Carolina. So I think if anybody can pull that name off, he probably can, and more power to him. I actually hope he keeps the name. I'd like to see it retaken for something a little more positive.
That's a great point. Great point. Yeah.
As far as IU, I look at it and I say to myself, well, if they are seriously in the running for 4- and 5-star players of this caliber at that position, I think you have to slow pedal it a little bit and see, okay, how high is the level of interest? What you don't want, it's a balancing act, because right now, if you look at the IU roster, you got Josh Newkirk at point guard for this year, and you got Devontae Green certainly on the roster, and we really don't know what we're going to get out of Devontae Green yet. But, certainly for 2018, you want to land a point guard of the future, and you don't want to have a situation where you get left holding the bag. That's always kind of the risk of the 5-star players. So this is where I think a guy like Phinisee, who's a very, very good player, who I think can grow into a real top-notch Big Ten type of point guard, I think that's where he might be a safer bet, because it gives them that baseline upon which they can operate. But look, I think what we have to get our heads wrapped around with all of this is that the national perception of IU in the recruiting circles is probably changing somewhat. And I'm certainly not privy to all of the details. I know not everybody else is, but just reading between the lines of what we've heard from coaches, from players, and just looking at the interest and the commits that we've seen so far, I don't think that we have to have the same sort of expectations about the players IU is going to bring in that we've had over the course of the past several years. So, I think for a lot of people, landing a Robert Finney within the confines of the recruiting that we've had the last few years would be like, it would be a godsend. Now it's like, okay, that would still, I think, be a great recruit, but I do think that you owe it to yourself to look around and now that the floodgates have opened up a little bit, see where you can land within that spectrum. And Finney may end up being the best choice all the way around on that, but I'm curious to see where some of these other possibilities land as well.
And I'll say it a little nicer that if you read between the lines, it seems like nationally people are kind of saying like, oh, it's like they got their act together. Like it's not a shit show there anymore. Like they know what they're doing. Like
is that nicer? Is that saying it nicer?
No. I mean, I'm saying it nice. You're saying it nicer. I'm just saying, as you read between the lines, like people are basically saying like, oh, like that was a clown show for the last 5 years. Like, oh, it's not. Like they know what they're doing. Like they're a player again.
Yeah. That was we had a similar question come in from Aaron Schuler, and it actually feeds in with this. Given recent commits, would you prioritize Garland and Romeo over Finney? Is Finney a championship level point guard? And I kind of just answered that with what I just said. I don't know. I think people are very mixed on Finney. Like I've heard people say, well, I don't think he can reach the level that some of these other guys can reach. I've heard other people say, guy would be awesome. Guy would be a pass first sort of facilitating type of player, which you like to have, certainly. And it would be cool, particularly as a guy that, grew up in the Lafayette area as an IU person. It'd be great to grab a top-level player out of that area, even if he went to McCutcheon, which was like our blood rival in high school. I'd be willing to overlook that, I guess, in the short term. But I don't know. I mean, I think, again, you run into risks if you overcommit to players that are in that stratosphere of Duke and North Carolina and Kentucky and Kansas. I think you can certainly pull one or two. I think down the line, IU can be in a position where they can recruit right up against those guys, but we're not there yet. Like there's too much foundational work that has to be done on this house before we can start worrying about what's on the second story. Yeah. So anyway, let's go to some other questions here. I did want to mention, I had a bunch of Ohio State people pop up in my timeline after the Hunter commitment today. And, one of them said something along the lines of, you're going to love Hunter. And they were really upset that he went to IU. They were really hoping that he was going to go to Ohio State. When I asked this guy who, broke the news about Hunter, what we were going to like the most about his game, the response was offensive versatility, polish, and humble, hardworking approach to the game. That was from Zach Fleer, who is the co-owner of 270 Hoops. And, I'll take that. If that's his game, an offensively versatile 6'7" guy, and he looks really good. I have to say, of the three players that I watched highlights of on YouTube, I was the most impressed with this player. I would highly recommend everybody go and watch his highlights. Very silky smooth sort of guy, seemed to really have good body control, seemed to know what was going on the floor. So I'm excited about him already. I think he's going to be a really good addition.
Ohio State, by the way, should have nothing to complain about considering they fired Thad Matta at like the worst time, seemed to have no idea who the hell they were going to hire, gave the offer out to like 5 bad coaches, and then lucked into like Chris Holtman, who I think is a great hire. Like I think that was a complete clown show that turned into like a great hire on their part. Like they did not mean for that to happen, but they turned it into a great hire.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't think that could have been handled as any worse than it was handled. The firing of Mata, and from everything I heard, they really thought they were getting. Stop me if this sounds familiar, Scott. They really thought they were getting Billy Donovan. And
was he in campus? Did he fly in there the day up? Did people see him in Columbus?
I don't know about that, but apparently there were a lot of donors who claimed that they had conversations with representatives from Billy Donovan. And
Billy Donovan needs to go kiss some ass around Oklahoma City. Like, he's like, guys, like I'm good here. Like, just make sure you're paying my salary. Like, I'm not leaving.
But no, I agree. I mean, as bad as that could have turned out for Ohio State, including some of the names that we were hearing at the tail end of the interview process, I think Holtman's going to be. I would not have been disappointed if Holtman had ended up at IU. I mean, I respect his coaching ability quite a bit. So.
I was telling that to other people. You and I, before Crean got fired, you and I had a call just off the record, like just talking about like if it were to happen, we had our 10 minutes of glee and we, screamed like girls. But then we came up with our list of like who we thought would be on that list. And like he was on our short list of people we wanted. And so,
I did not scream like a girl. Okay.
I was talking about myself. You were calm and collected. I was talking about myself.
Uh-huh.
I opened my Trapper Keeper, got out the pen with the thing on it.
Anyway, let's move on and tackle some more questions here. We had we are going to get to IU football. I promised our guy Jeff Showalter that. He was upset that I guess we weren't promoting the football part of the podcast enough, but we will get to football a little bit later on. We had a couple of questions from actually we had one from Jared over at Assembly Call. By the way, thank you to Assembly Call and Inside the Hall for keeping the podcast fires burning on the independent media front, and then of course on the Gannett front, Zach Osterman has been doing podding regularly. It's been a great time for podcasts with IU sports in general. This is the golden age of IU podcasts. You folks are in great. Jared asked if we're planning to break any news. No breaking of news here. We are simply analyzing. So if you came for news breaking, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah, I don't even know what the hell's going on. You're breaking news to me. Like, how am I going to break anything?
I guess I did break it to Scott, so I guess I lied partially there. But he also asked, will Scott be the fourth IU commitment today? We do need a point guard after all. I've seen Scott run point. I don't think that's the direction we need to go, frankly.
Yes, I was more of a power forward for the WIUX team in the late 90s and early 2000s. We want to win games. Like, I would love to wear the candy stripe pants, but we want to win games. So, Jared, I appreciate it. But you thought you hated some old IU point guards. You would not have any. Oh, my God. I'd be so hated. I want to be the last guy on the bench. I want to be Priller. Like, me and Priller, I just want to hang on the corner with him, man.
We've got, if you want to ask questions, hit us up at CrimsonCast on Twitter, or you can hit us up right here in the video stream. We'd love to hear from you. Some questions here from friend of the pod, Andy Wittry. Let's see, where did those go? There was a question here. Map out your ideal future non-conference schedule for IU. What home and homes would you want to see, and what events and what mid-majors? So let me have you tackle this one first, Scott. What would you like to see? We're already seeing the schedule take shape. We've already seen some of this, for this year, and it's a tough schedule. I mean, this year's schedule is significantly tougher, I think, than what we've seen already in previous years. So what's your ideal down the road?
That's not saying much.
No, it's not.
And this
it's saying quite a bit. But anyway, go on.
True. Well, and this goes to another point that I wanted to make, just kind of about reading between the lines. Like, if you hear the Archie Miller staff now talking about making this schedule, they're kind of, I forget the exact quote. I have it somewhere. When I say somewhere, I mean like on the internet somewhere. But I mean, like the quote was like, we weren't left with much to work with, which is kind of nuts, because it's not like Crean was fired 2 days ago. Like, it was March. Like, he should have had most of the schedule being put together for next year. Like, I think that was their way of saying, like, the schedule was absolutely dog shit and we had nothing to work with. So I mean, I think it again shows, like, just I think we would have been shocked if we saw how insanely dysfunctional things were going there at the end. Like, I really think it was a mess. Anyway, what I would like to see is, it's something I think you and I have talked about. Like, I don't think we particularly, I'll say it's like two or three things. Like, I don't think we particularly need to be playing like Kansas and Kentucky and Duke all the time. I think all we needed to do, like, our schedule wasn't horrendous. Like, I like that we played in like the early classic. Like, I would like to see us in one of those early tournaments or ESPN kind of showcase games every year. Like, whether it's the 4 teams in Indy, like, hey, what do you know? We're playing in Indy. Maybe we could be there. We're playing on a battleship, like kind of do what Michigan State does at the beginning of the year. Like, play one of those games that's just on TV. But then the rest of the schedule, like, the Crossroads, I still like the Crossroads. I understand it may not be the best opponents, but really all you got to do is start swapping out some of those, like, Grand Canyon State games for like Evansville or Eastern Michigan or Bowling Green. Like, you don't need to play a top 10 team every single weekend, but just swap out some of those really, really sub 300 teams and put in a regional team that is at least top 150, like I said, Evansville or Southern Illinois, or so to me, I would like to see that, and then sprinkle in a couple of games. I think we'd all love to see the Kentucky series come back in, but I think there's so much other politics involved with that. I think finding the right weekend is going to be tough, especially when that's where the Crossroads ends up being kind of a problem. But for me, I think one of those early season tournaments, one of those early season kind of marquee games, upping the other non-conference, and I'm good.
So the schedule as it stands right now, for those who haven't been paying attention, you've got whatever this classic is. I don't even know what the proper terminology is, but Howard, South Florida, Arkansas State, and Eastern Michigan coming into Assembly Hall between November 12th and November 24th. That's not bad, all things considered. I mean, when you consider the teams that have been coming into Assembly Hall during that stretch of time the last couple of years, you're at Seton Hall on Wednesday, November 15th. You've got Duke coming into Assembly Hall on Wednesday, November 29th. You're at Louisville on the 9th of December. You got Notre Dame in the Crossroads on the 16th, and then you've got Youngstown State coming in on Friday, December 29th. There's a few more games to add. As far as what I'd like to see long term, I mean,
I forgot to say, sorry, I want more games in New York. Like we got to have more games in New York.
Well, we got the Big Ten tournament there now, so that's taken care of.
More. I want them all. I want to play everything in Madison Square Garden, like move Assembly Hall. Sorry.
I am fascinated to see how fewer games we play in New York compared to what we played here recently. I'm fascinated to see how that goes. But anyway, look, I think the Kentucky series needs to be back on the schedule. There were a lot of misconceptions about the Kentucky series and what it's meant historically, and a lot of people got caught up in the whole, we need to play it on campus sites. It was fascinating that Fred Glass walked completely away from that after Crean got fired and said, we'll play them anywhere. And people forget that historically that series has been played in neutral sites as, at least in the last 30 years, as much as it was played on campus sites. that was a hallmark of when you and I were growing up. Was
my dad and I went to the game for 12 straight years, and then he was always in Indy or in Louisville. I never went. It was all, and that's actually, sorry to interrupt. It was great. I love the red and blue, cut to the middle. That was awesome. You had it 1 year in Indy, 1 year in Louisville. Yeah.
So I think that game has to be back on the schedule. I mean, I love the fact that there's a regular series with Louisville. That was always, again, a hallmark of IU schedules of past years. And look, I'll say this. I mean, I think always have, something on the schedule where you're playing, another team that's outside of the region. That's a kind of a marquee matchup. I mean, people have talked about a home and home with Arizona. That'd be fun. That would be an interesting one because we've never had one of those before. We used to play Kansas in a home and home.
Actually, we played it when we had a 58-game home winning streak or something.
Yes, we did. Well, and then we also it was like a neutral home and home because the first game was actually at the RCA Dome, and then that was followed up by a game at Kansas, and then it was followed up by a game in Bloomington. And that was a really fun series. I mean, Kansas won 2 out of 3, but IU ended up beating them. And that was that year when Neil Reed and Andre Patterson were freshmen. That was not a season when you would have expected IU to beat Kansas at home, but they did handily. And look, I think as far as mid-majors are concerned, just schedule smart. I mean, and I've talked about this with Kyle Lamb, who's an occasional contributor to CrimsonCast, and we've talked about it's not hard to schedule so that the RPI thinks you're a better team than you are. And, it's about, and you can easily project where teams are going to land in the RPI and how they're going to look. And, I think this has been mentioned a couple of times now, the number of just abjectly terrible opponents that Tom Crean would schedule, knocked IU down the totem pole in the eyes of the NCAA by a significant margin. You can easily replace those games with games against just bad teams who are, ranked in the 150 to 200 range rather than being ranked in the 300 range. And so, I think it's cool. You have a game against a local regional, team every now and again. I thought the IPFW game last year was great, even though we lost. I think playing against Indiana State's great. When we played Evansville early on in the Crean era, I thought that was a fun little series. Those games are good on a number of levels. And I think if you're Archie Miller and you're trying to build your team up mentally, that's a good way to do it because you need to be challenged if you're going to be a team that is going to compete down the stretch. And that's something I think that, Crean's team struggled with at times. I mean, not every year, certainly. And the 2 years they won the Big Ten, they played well down the stretch, but other years they did not. So I just think it doesn't have to be Michigan State's last year where they just played a ridiculous number of top teams, but we can do a lot better, I guess would be the way I put it.
I would also just throw out there that I think we should schedule like the NCAA schedules the tournament, in the sense that I think we have some unique opportunities to do some kind of stunt scheduling, in the sense that Arizona is a perfect example. Like, a couple of years ago, I think Syracuse is a great example. We played Syracuse in the Carrier Dome. Like, it got a lot of press. It's like the last time they, because of the 87 championship, and they beat us a couple of years before in the tournament. But like, you think about Arizona would get a lot of press just because you have the brothers playing each other. Like UCLA would be interesting. You get Alford. Like, I think at this point, us trying to kind of get back up to that stoop, I think doing some of those scheduling games, there's a lot of teams out there that have some interesting Indiana ties that I could see getting kind of pumped up. Like if UCLA came to Bloomington, that would be a big story. Like Alford coming back, like playing. People would kind of forget he did it with Iowa a bunch of times, but I think that would get some pub. So I think looking at that, like I think the Arizona thing with the Miller brothers would be awesome. So I think those kind of things could help us too.
A couple of the questions from listeners. We had a question about. So the question from one of our listeners was, depending on the metrics, Tom Crean only recruited 2 top 15/20 players, which was Zeller and Vonleh. And then you had a few players outside of that, Yogi and James Blackman Jr. and Thomas Bryant just kind of missed out just barely on being top 20 players. Do you think it's possible to both reach and sustain high-level success without consistently landing 5-star kids? Not to say Indiana can or will be a Kentucky, Duke, Arizona, but can IU win on the biggest stage without eventually bringing in 1 to 2 5-star players annually on average? Well, okay, that's a good question. I think it's possible to be in the conversation, but I think you're going to have to land a couple of those 5-star style kids, at least in the current environment. Now, certainly if the recruiting environment changes, that will change things as well. I mean, if the NBA changes their rules so that players can go early, then suddenly the equation changes a bit. And suddenly I think, having a really solid bed of 4-stars with an occasional 5-star sprinkled in, I guess it changes there because you don't know how many 5-stars are going to be around versus just going directly to the pros. That said, where IU's at right now, they have to have, I think, consistent classes of 4-star or rising 3-star prospects in the system to fill the holes before they can really think about, being able to sprinkle in the 5-stars and have them make a huge difference. I mean, I think the big problem that you ran into, and Noah Vonleh's a good example. I mean, yeah, he was a top 20 player. I forget exactly where he landed, but even though that team had some highly regarded players, they didn't mesh particularly well, and it was very much a paper sort of year in terms of how good that IU team was supposed to be versus how good they actually were on the floor. For IU, I think to some degree, we forget that IU can recruit at that level. I mean, like all of the recruiting resources are there. They haven't been applied quite the way that you would hope. And certainly under Bob Knight, I mean, he had kind of a reputation of shying away from 5-stars, but he got his fair share of highly rated guys. I mean, it wasn't like he didn't get any top 25 players over the course of the last 15 years of his time. But it's been very spotty recruiting on that front. And a lot of it just because I think of the instability in the IU program and the instability in various things relating to that. And so what you end up with is this situation where certainly Duke and Kentucky and North Carolina and Arizona, they've kind of built their brands around, being the sorts of places that can land those sorts of players. I think IU can certainly – the intermediate step right now is can they build into something like Villanova, where Villanova, consistently was getting these kind of borderline 4-star, 5-star guys, and then everything came together. They got a couple of guys who were really highly regarded to combine with this really solid team, and they end up winning a national championship. And they had managed to, be a very good team that had some bad tournament luck in years prior to that. The formula can work if you do it the right way. And so I don't know what the ceiling is for IU as a program, because I would argue that the ceiling from a recruiting perspective hasn't even been reached for consistently for probably 20 years, 25 years. I mean, it's been a weird time for a program that's a blue blood like IU is, in terms of the way they've, been able to stockpile recruits or not, I guess, as the case may be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think you kind of answered it well with Villanova. you can be successful in today's college basketball without a bunch of 5-stars. But I think your path just becomes a lot harder, and you're much more susceptible to having some bad luck in March. And don't get me wrong, I think what Kentucky's doing has its own, getting 10 5-stars. You've got to get all those guys happy. It's a different level of, it's a different, thing to manage. But it's, if you don't have all of that talent, your road becomes much narrower. And I would just say this, that, for those of us who've watched the last 5 or 10 years, like, think of when Cody Zeller came in, just how much he transformed that team from day one. I think of him and I think of Eric Gordon, like, of the two best players I've seen in the last 20 years who, like, day one you came in, you're like, holy crap, that guy's an NBA player. And, like, they just they add a level that just it's like, and Oladipo was getting there, but just think of how much like, if you took Cody Zeller away from that team, they're just not the same team. Like, he just everything went on a hyperdrive the minute he went up there.
Yeah, no, it's like, breaking news: good basketball players make teams better. Film at 11. I mean, so it is kind of silly. I guess I look at the question more as,
if we get LeBron, like, I think we'll be all right. Like, if we get LeBron, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can land those players regularly, but you have to be the sort of place that those players want to play at. And I think one of the things that we've seen start to trickle out is the perception of the program here maybe wasn't the best for attracting those sorts of players. You would get an occasional player here and there, but with Zeller being the notable exception, and again, Yogi Ferrell, I think, grew into the role gradually, but it was a little rough for him at the start, but Thomas Bryant, for being a 5-star guy, he had some really good games. I mean, but it was rough for him at times. And I never felt like he fully ever hit his stride as an IU player. I think the same could be said for Noah Vonleh. And each of those guys had individual reasons why. But if you're that caliber of a player, if you're there for a year or 2 years or whatever, you want to go somewhere where you're going to be showcased or maybe be able to showcase yourself, is a better way of putting it. But you also want to know that you're going to a place that is going to be stable and is going to be the best for your development. And I just don't know if that was in the mindset of a lot of those sorts of players. I think what you said earlier was pretty on the nose about, IU's a big name. You can use it as a bargaining chip if you're trying to get an offer from a better, maybe better is the wrong word, but a more attractive to you school. It'll be interesting to see if that mentality changes. We had a couple other questions. Actually, comments. Another breaking news story. Matt Zimmerman's just excited. He said, just an optimism and pride in IU basketball I haven't felt since Donald Trump was just some East Coast rich guy who used to own a USFL team. So there was a correction from Craig Overway. We were in the hunt for Finney before Archie. He visited unofficially like 3 times last year. The way he's been playing, not sure he's an automatic take at this point. I think both of those are accurate, so I'll give you that. I wasn't hearing his name mentioned nearly as much prior to Archie coming in as a legitimate, serious possibility as we've heard since then. We also had a correction from someone else that Noah Vonleh was actually an earlier commit. He wasn't a late commit, a la Thomas Bryant. So apologies for that. We try to get everything right here. But we had one other question from Brad Burkhart on basketball. Were these coordinated commitments, or was it more of after the first commit, the floodgates opened? I guess I don't know what you mean by coordinated. I would say certainly the fact that, 3 of them announced in a very short period of time, I get the feeling that the players talk enough on this level that they know what's going on. And so I would think that there was at least some degree of maybe indirect coordination going on as far as the recruit announcements coming up. So, and I think that's cool. I mean, I think, to some degree, especially in basketball, if you've got other people in the class that or of that you've gotten to know and you're planning to, commit to the play, it's good to not be the only one. And so I think that there's probably something to that. So anyway, let's switch over and talk a little bit of football. We will talk more basketball on our next podcast, but let's go ahead and switch over and talk a little bit about football. Training camp getting set to start here soon. Some really good preseason stuff for some IU football players, but we should tackle the big news first, which was that Simi Cobbs Jr. was arrested at a Jason Aldean concert at Klipsch Music Center in Noblesville, Indiana, maybe better known to some of you as Deer Creek.
Always Deer Creek.
Always Deer Creek. So the arrest occurred, I think a few days ago, and a lot of kind of confused reaction to what was going on with all of this. Scott, you've gotten a chance to take a look at this, and you also are the resident Hamilton County resident of CrimsonCast. So I'm going to let you tackle this first. What's your take on this situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm live from Hamilton County. I'm, the crowds are outside. I'm hearing the bombs overhead. From all I've read, I was not there. Was not hitting the Jason Aldean concert this summer. I wasn't there, but from all I read, he was intoxicated and he wasn't clearing the aisleway. And I was kind of waiting for the next part where he was brandishing a gun or he was hitting somebody over the head with a beer. That was all that it was. Which just it seems like a very, very. I bet there's 1,000 other things happening at Deer Creek that night that are worthy of being arrested. I've done things at Deer Creek that I probably need to be arrested for that don't involve being drunk. Okay, that's not great. And being, I was not there, so I don't know.
And I'll be honest, I've read some of this. I haven't seen the drunk part at all. So I mean, I think there was he wasn't or refused to take a breathalyzer or something like that. I think that was part of it, but it seemed to be based on he wasn't clearing the aisleway, which just again, I wasn't there, and but it's just if that's the case, I'm surprised that if you arrest somebody. And then you know he's an IU football player. Again, I know it's not this isn't Notre Dame or Ohio State, but you have to know it's going to make some kind of news. I'm not saying you just let IU players get away with stuff, but you would think that Hamilton County Police would at least come up with something more than he was also doing ... It just if that's all you got, it seems like a very, very weak reason to arrest somebody. So I kind of view it with a little bit of suspicion. So I don't know. I'm quoting from the Indy Star piece right now. The misdemeanor charges are refusal to identify and resisting law enforcement. There's the only mention of alcohol is refuse to take a breathalyzer test for alcohol, which in and of itself proves nothing on the alcohol front. I mean, and I'm with you on this. I mean, it seems incredibly weak. That is what the arrest, because and particularly
and that's the best they have because they put that on there. That's the best they have.
Right. I mean, the idea that refusal to identify is one of the weaker charges you're going to find, and resisting law enforcement is kind of a catch-all if you read enough police reports. And look, again, like you said, I wasn't there. I can't testify to anything that occurred. This does seem like a bit of a tempest in a teapot. I think that certainly there have been some bad decisions made by some IU football players in the past, and it's resulted in some negative press. I would strongly, I would take this with a large grain of salt as far as throwing it into that category. I think this just seems suspiciously trumped up, and maybe I'm just too cynical at this point. But I'm again, like you said, when I saw the news, I was expecting there to be a lot more. And if that's all, I mean, and there's not even
no drugs on a possible person.
Refused to take a breathalyzer test. Well, if he had hypothetically been intoxicated and he got arrested, that they would have done a chemical test on him to see if he was actually intoxicated. And the fact that that's not included in the report should give you a pretty good indication of.
And he had no drugs on him because he was arrested. And they checked and.
Right. So again, I mean, failure to clear the aisle, man, that okay. I mean, I think the take home point from this might be just to buy lawn seats. I don't know if there's anything else we can take away from this at this point.
Or friends don't let friends go to Jason Aldean concerts. Maybe that's the answer.
I mean, it's nuts.
Think about it. If they're playing at Penn State, what's the opposing crowd even going to chant? How do you make fun of this? Besides the fact you're at a Jason Aldean concert, what do you say? It's hey, what rhymes with aisle? What rhymes with resistance?
No, it's nothing. No. Yeah. So anyway, we wanted to talk about that. I also wanted to make mention of the fact that training camp.
We have a football team. We're playing this fall.
We're playing this fall. Training camp starting here soon. We're going to get into our deep dives with IU football, within the next probably by the last 2 weeks of August. We normally launch in around then. So I guess my question for you is, the summer is normally fairly quiet. We haven't heard a whole lot as far as this year's team is concerned. Is there anything that you are like, what are your feelings right now going into the season, I guess would be the big question. Like, are you feeling more optimistic than the last time we talked? Are you pessimistic? Are you just curious? Like, what are your feelings as we head into the first year of the Tom Allen era?
I guess I'm just curious. I mean, it's going to be interesting. I think what I'm hoping to see is our defense going to kind of keep the same consistency that we've had the last couple of years? Because I think we've shown that offense can kind of come and go, and I'm not as concerned about the offense, because honestly, Kevin Wilson was the offensive genius, and we had some great offenses, but what's going to get us success in football is a consistent defense. I mean, we've seen it under all of our offense is kind of like you just hit a couple guys, you get a Randall L, or you get, sadly, unfortunately, a James Hardy, but you get a great player and your offense could be all right, and we've had coaches who I didn't think were great offensive coaches. And, you get like Ben Chappell, he ends up doing pretty good. Like our problem has always been our defense. Like, honestly, I've never been like, we can't score. The only year our offense was just terrible was the year Xander Diamont was our quarterback, and that was only because of like a string of bad transfers and injuries. And that was the only year it's like we couldn't score. I mean, we've had pretty bad teams where we're putting up like 28-35 against Ohio State or Michigan, except they score like 70 or 60. So it's really the defense. So for me, it's like, are we going to see that consistent defense growth that we've seen year after year? Unfortunately, I think our schedule doesn't do us a lot of favors. Opening up against Ohio State, that's a kick in the teeth. You have 3, winnable games, but then it's like Penn State, Michigan State. It's like, I don't know how we ever get out of this being in the East of the Big Ten, but it's like, I'm not sure we're going to really see this team get its footing or get itself comfortable until like the end of October when we play Maryland. But then it's like we turn around and play Wisconsin.
Yeah, the schedule's fascinating. I mean, and people's predictions are all over the place. I mean, SB Nation had a prediction. I think they had IU at like 7-5.
Take it. I cash in. I'm cashing in.
Trust me, I would take that in a heartbeat. I'm still looking at the schedule, and it's weird. Scott, you and I have done this for several years now, where we do the schedule and we're overly optimistic, like stupidly so. And then this year, I feel like everybody else is being optimistic, and I'm like, I think we're only going to win 5 games. And I haven't totally come off that yet, because there's just a bunch of individual items that I'm worried about.
There was a year a couple years ago, I was like 9 wins. Like I fully saw a path to 9 wins like 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was a bad decision on your part. It really was. We did go to a bowl that year, though, so there's that. But no, I just – the one thing I'll say, and like I said, we'll get into the specifics later. The one thing I'll say is that our, lost in the Kevin Wilson firing or whatever you want to call it, is the fact that, his teams may not have ever like really gotten over the hump, but they at least got to the hump a few years. They had some bad luck in a couple of seasons, and they needed X, Y, and Z in order to get like to the 8-win mark. But the fact that they were as consistently average as they were, it was actually significantly good when you compare it to the rest of IU football history, frankly, or most of the rest of IU football history. I don't think it's an automatic that this coaching regime will have the same sort of success. Everything I've heard, and I've met Tom Allen, and I've heard people talk about Tom Allen, everything I've heard has been very, very positive. People think this is a guy who can really do the job, that he's going to have a lot of success. And I desperately want to believe them. And I think that the possibilities are certainly there. But it's always a big question mark when a guy's got his first head coaching job, and it's a job as difficult as IU, and you've shown so much, prowess as a defensive guru. Does that transfer over to you being a head coach? I mean, do you have that sort of morale and mentality boost that you're able to infuse the whole team with? If you have that, suddenly we are in a lot better shape than I think a lot of people thought we would be. But if you don't, or if you're not sure, it's hard to just go gung ho and say, yeah, we're in great shape. things are just going to go on this complete upward trajectory. You always, if you're smart, I think, with the defense, you worry, okay, after such a huge leap, do they regress to the mean statistically? And what does that mean? You worry about, the impact of playing 5 road Big Ten games and then having your home Big Ten games include Ohio State and Wisconsin and Michigan. These sorts of things, these are not generally things that bode well for IU football historically. And, I hate to be like the bucket of cold water on this, but you really need to see what this team plays like throughout the whole month of September just to get a sense of how they're going to look under Tom Allen, because we really have no clue at this point. I don't think you can take the bowl game as much evidence of anything. They could end up playing great, but who knows?
Yeah, let's not dive too deep into this, but it's tough when, the years you have a Wisconsin coming from that side of the Big Ten, like you're basically looking at 5 losses. Like every year you're going to play Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, and Penn State. And more than likely that's 4 losses. When you play Wisconsin, that's probably 5. It's like now your path to 7 is you got to be perfect in every other game. And that's asking a lot for a brand new coach. And unfortunately, until we're just in a different situation, which isn't going to happen next year, 7-5 is like, that's the best we can possibly look for, unless we're really thinking we're going to knock off Ohio State or Michigan and win all the games we're supposed to win. So it's like the path to get into 7-8 wins is tough. And so it's like every year when you start off with 4 losses just on the table, that's tough.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. And like I said, we'll dive into this in a lot more detail.
Good news.
Yeah. Well, we'll dive into it in more detail when we get a little bit later on into August, as we see how things shake out in training camp and as we lead into that Ohio State game on Thursday night, the 31st of August. Scott, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, man. Keep telling me news. I look forward to the next CrimsonCast when I find out our schedule has been released or Romeo signed, or is Crean still our coach? Like, what else do you need to tell me? What's going on here?
I'll break some news that there's a Zaxby's opening up in Westfield. How about that?
That we do have Zaxby's up in North Side.
Yeah, but you don't have it. You don't have it north of 465, do you?
If I think so.
Oh, well, see, you just broke news to me, so this is good news. Now
I need to look. There's a good chicken place. I thought it was Zaxby's up here.
Well, why don't you do some research, man? Do some research for the pod next time.
And I've been there too. I'm trying to. All right. Well, I'll answer this off air, and the next time you wait and see, because there's no other way for anybody else to find out. No other Google machine. Stay off the internet, people.
Anyway, thanks to all you folks for watching or listening. If you're listening on the pod, thanks to everybody who wrote questions in. For Scott, I'm Galen. This has been CrimsonCast. We'll catch you on the flip side. So long, everybody.